All right, we're here for a video on female reproductive anatomy and some histology, and really to get sort of a broad overview of female reproductive function before we get into the details of endocrine control. So I think it makes sense to sort of review anatomical structure so we can see sort of where these things are happening and which cells are, found where. And if you recall from the male reproductive anatomy, that was essentially this sort of complex tubular system, right, where the seminiferous tubules were connected to the efferent ducts through the rete, and then to the epididymis, to the vas deferens, to the ejaculatory. It was like one tube to the next to the next. And there is some continuity with that in the female system, but there's a gap. And that's kind of important because of that gap, we have some ancillary structures. So let's sort of follow the pathway that leads to fertilization, right? And so here we have the vaginal canal. At the top end of the vaginal canal, we have the sort of the bottom portion of the cervix, or sorry, of the uterus, that sort of pokes down into the top of this and sort of connected to the distal end of the or maybe proximal end of the vaginal canal, right? And so here's the uterus, right? And so the bottom cervix region of the uterus has to have an opening. It's called the cervical os or ostium. And so sperm are ejaculated into the vaginal orifice, and then they have to pass through this canal in this region called the isthmus of the cervix to enter the uterus. Now, fertilization pretty much never takes place in the uterus itself. The uterus is the location where development, embryonic development and fetal development will occur. And so here we have you can see the sperm, and they're going to pass up into the fallopian tubes, right? And one on each side. And the fallopian tubes sort of lead to, at the end here, the ovary. And the ovary is just sort of suspended here, if you will, between the uterus and the abdominal wall. And the fallopian tube just sort of like butts up against it, but is not physically attached to it. And so the sperm are going to sort of because of their motility, and maybe even more so because of contractions of smooth muscle in the wall of the uterus, smooth muscle in the wall of the vaginal canal, smooth muscle in the wall of the fallopian tube, get driven, upwards and into these fallopian tubes. Now, if ovulation has not occurred recently, then there's no egg available, and these sperm will sort of like actually embed themselves in the wall here and hang out for upwards of a week. And so, interestingly, fertilization can occur significantly after ovulation, right? Because viable sperm can hang out sort of attached to the fallopian tube walls, the inner walls, sort of waiting for ovulation to occur. Now, conversely, the egg, which is ovulated from the ovary, from follicles in the ovary, is going to be taken up by, we'll see this in a couple of slides, but taken up by the fallopian tube. There's a structure called the fimbria, there it is down here, that are lined with cilia that sweep inward, right, to sort of pull this ovulated egg and associated cells called the corona radiata into the fallopian tube. And what's normally going to happen is the sperm and the egg are going to meet somewhere within the fallopian tube, and then they will, through ciliary action, will continue to move downward toward the uterus, and that actually takes about a week. And so cell division is occurring along this pathway, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll see that coming up, but I just want to point out that implantation of the developing embryo will occur, probably about a week after fertilization, and it occurs down here in the endometrial layer of the uterine wall, right? And so sperm come in, right? Possibly hang out because an egg's not there. Egg is ovulated from the ovary, taken up by the ciliated fallopian tube. Fertilization typically takes place in the fallopian tube, and then that fertilized egg is going to travel backwards the same way the sperm came in into the uterus for implantation. So interestingly, the bit about the discontinuous system here is that the egg is ovulated essentially into the peritoneal cavity, right? There are what are called ectopic pregnancies where, and really rarely, uh, sperm make it all the way here, fertilize the egg, and then but the egg ends up implanting, like, somewhere over here in the wall of the pelvic cavity. They usually don't go very far in terms of development. The most likely place or location for ectopic pregnancies is actually in the fallopian tube, and obviously this is not built for, dramatic development of an embryo, and it can lead to big problems. Many of them spontaneously abort. Sometimes they require surgery because you can rupture the fallopian tube if it does not spontaneously abort. But again, those are just sort of anomalies of fertilization and implantation that occur occasionally. All right, so I'll take a closer look here at the ovary. Sorry, I always have to wait for my cursor to pop up. We have to look at sort of the follicular development, right? And the follicular development is this sort of, well, let me describe it. So the egg has cells associated with it so these are somatic cells from the ovary. And so a follicle is an oocyte or an egg plus the associated cells with it. And so during early development, fetal development, these primordial follicles develop. Trying to point, there it is. Primordial follicles develop. And this is basically an egg surrounded by a single layer of follicular cells. So these are sort of undeveloped follicular cells, if you will. They're squamous, flat, and they're not really doing anything. Later on, when we talk about more developed follicles, the association of cells in the follicular wall is what leads to a significant portion of female reproductive hormone production. But before that happens, so again, during development, primordial follicles, about 2 million eggs or so are developed and form primordial follicles before reproductive maturity at puberty. A huge number of them, probably, 80 or 90% of them undergo what's called atresia. You go from several million down to several 100,000. Maybe 500,000 primordial follicles. And then those primordial follicles, so again, they're developed and they're undergoing atresia, which is basically apoptosis, and the numbers fall, up to the age of puberty. And then at puberty, there are intra-ovarian signaling mechanisms that start to convert primordial follicles into primary follicles. It is not anterior pituitary hormone dependent at that point. And if you think about it, if it was, then all of the primordial follicles would all be activated to sort of develop at once, and that's not what happens. So there's this signaling system that's not well understood, such that the primordial follicles in groups of about 15 to 20 or 25 develop with each ovarian cycle. And so the primary follicles are basically that same oocyte, now surrounded by the granulosa cells, which are becoming cuboidal, and they're dividing, and so they're increasing the number of layers. So there's no longer a simple layer, now it's a stratified layer of granulosa cells. And again, still not producing, at this stage, the primary follicle, still not producing any hormones. And over the course of about a year, the primary follicle will develop into a secondary follicle. This is many, many, many more cells. Now we're talking about millions of cells in the follicular layers here. Here's the oocyte in the center. Now it's surrounded by these associated granulosa cells of the corona radiata. There are going to be these associated thecal cells that sort of like glom on from the outside to the outside of the follicle from the cortex of the ovary here, this outer layer of the ovary where the follicles develop. The inner layer is more vascular. And anyway, so you have these multiple cycles, right? So each folliculogenesis cycle going from a primordial follicle, and really remember going from here, right? One group of these is stimulated basically once per month, once per ovarian cycle to form the primary follicles. And then it takes about a year to go from a primary follicle to this mature secondary follicle. And it has this, they're called antral secondary follicles because it has this fluid-filled space. As we'll point out later, that's really important to the ovulation, right? The egg has to become separated from the follicle. The whole follicle is not ovulated. It's just the egg and this layer of cells called the corona radiata. And so this, what's with this 10 million other cells out here, the thecal cells and the granulosa cells? Well, they're the ones that are going to be producing a lot of estrogen, but other hormones as well, that are helping to feed back to the pituitary and regulate the reproductive hormones. Because again, or maybe not again, but one of the key components here, key elements, is that we have to coordinate ovulation and, of course, potential fertilization, right? Potential fertilization, with the uterine wall being prepared for possible implantation about a week later, right? And so it's this cyclical cycle, right? We sort of prepare the, unlike the males that were producing like 25 million sperm a minute, females produce, quote unquote, produce and release one egg per month, approximately. And so, in this interim period, right, the uterine wall has to sort of like prepare and begin to secrete and grow so that implantation can occur. And if pregnancy and implantation don't occur, then that wall breaks down and the cycle starts all over again. And the thing about these figures that's really pretty much incorrect in every textbook is that it shows basically a single cycle. And there are at least a dozen cycles going on at any given moment, meaning that there's a cohort, right? Because it takes about a year to go from primary to this, antral secondary follicle. This is the mature follicle or almost mature follicle here. But it's about a year to get from here to here. Well, right? But you have an ovarian cycle that is only 1 month long, which means that you have to have a cycle that's behind this cycle and then one that's behind that cycle and one that's behind that one, all sort of leading to, this slow development, right? So again, the timing of how these get kicked off is kind of intriguing, and it's not well understood because again, it's probably tied to some degree to the pituitary hormones, but it can't be dependent upon it because again, we don't want all the follicles developing simultaneously. Okay. So here's our mature follicle, sometimes called the Graafian follicle or the tertiary follicle. This is the one that's going to ovulate the egg and its corona radiata. Here's that ovulation is actually occurring. The follicle is not done at that point. The follicle actually takes up an enormous amount of cholesterol and becomes this yellowish structure known as the corpus luteum. Corpus means body, luteum means yellow, so it literally means yellow body. And it is a hormone secreting factory that will help sustain the uterine wall if implantation is occurring. And we'll see that's sort of the second half. There's sort of two halves to the ovarian cycle, and then because of that, there's sort of two halves to the uterine cycle as well. Sort of a breakdown cycle, portion of it, and then a rebuilding portion. Anyway, and then if pregnancy does not occur, this structure, this corpus luteum, does not last, and it becomes this sort of remnant structure called the corpus albicans, which literally means white body, and it's basically like scar tissue, and they're slowly absorbed over time and tend to pretty much disappear. So again, we're sort of traveling clockwise around this pattern here, but remember, from about this secondary follicle, like a mature secondary follicle, to the corpus luteum is about a month. That's that to the degradation of the corpus luteum, is about a month. That's the ovarian cycle. And then remember, from primordial to the secondary antral follicles is the better part of a year, right? And again, you'd have more than one of these cycles going on at any given time. So this is just simplified. It's only showing one of those cycles. Okay, next figure shows kind of the same thing, but it just sort of marches you through the maybe in sort of cartoon version what's sort of happening. Here's the primordial follicles, the atresia that's going on. We're just reducing the numbers dramatically, go from 5 to 7 million. I think I said 2 million. I'm not sure why. It gets reduced to 2 million. Sorry about that. 5 to 7 million at birth, 2 million at birth, so pre-birth, and then 2 million at birth, and then that's going to fall even further until puberty, which is when we're going to go from primordial to primary in these groups. Atresia is going to continue to occur. Secondary follicle, remember, the layers are increasing, and the cells have become cuboidal, and then we start to develop the antral spaces, the fluid-filled spaces, as the secondary follicle matures. And so all the way through, right, continue this top line down to this line down here. That's about a year, right? It's this antral secondary follicle that develops to become the tertiary follicle that takes about 2 weeks, the first half of the ovarian cycle, which again, a lot of textbooks have wrong. They show it wrong, at least, because they show either a primary or a primordial going all the way to Graafian follicle in 14 days, which is crazy because, I mean, here you see it. I have it listed as 340 days. Okay, so here's that part again, just for reference at the top. And then here's the actual ovarian cycle. And again, if we're going to talk about hormonal control of this, then we have to look at the ovarian cycle, because that's when the hormones are really being produced, and that's when the pituitary, FSH, and LH will play their biggest roles. And so again, we go from the secondary antral follicle that enters the ovarian cycle, again, almost a year old already, to ovulation, which is right in the middle of the ovarian cycle, again, approximately day 14. Here's the oocyte and the corona radiata around it, getting ovulated, again, out into the abdominal cavity, if you will, but it's picked up by the fallopian tube. And then this process of luteinization, where the follicular component becomes the corpus luteum, which is going to produce, as you can see here, lots of progesterone and some estrogen. If we go back here to the follicular phase, so it's actually the ovarian cycle is divided up into the follicular component, right, where the follicle's developing, to the luteal component, or portion of the phase. We're going to switch from an estrogen dominant phase to a progesterone dominant phase. And again, we'll come back to that when we do the endocrine components. All right, well, let's look at that ovulated egg now, just to sort of see what's happening to it. Right here it is, coming out of that tertiary follicle. Again, it's being picked up by the fimbria with their cilia. It's moving off into the fallopian tube. And again, the sperm may already be there, or they're, and maybe not. Maybe they might meet it after a few days in the fallopian tube. Fertilization takes place. Here it is over here. The multiple sperm are required actually to sort of digest through the corona radiata, and then only a single, hopefully. Otherwise, you have a condition called polyspermine, which is not good. It's too much DNA. Those usually spontaneously abort. But then we get a cell fusion between the sperm and the egg, all right, and we start to undergo cell division, and we go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to finally we end up with this sort of multicellular structure called a blastocyst, which is about 7 days old or so. That's going to actually embed and become the developing embryo in the wall of the uterus, right? Remember, just again for informational sake, an ectopic pregnancy is when it doesn't properly travel through ciliary motion largely and gets implanted in the fallopian tube. Right? And remember, the ovary is sitting there doing its thing. It's got its next cycle in line, getting ready to, with a secondary antral follicle ready to become the tertiary follicle for the cycle that's going to start, within 2 weeks of this one. Okay, I think we'll continue with the hormones in the next video.